Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Gentlemen, the Commissioner has heard some evidence previously about a clause that is negotiated in some communal licenses, which is known as the mortally wounded clause. And as I understand that, it permits fishers to retain non-target species, perhaps for which the fishery is closed, if the fish which is caught during an open fishery is mortally wounded. Mr. Rosenberger, is that a sort of a fair summary of what these clauses attempt to accomplish?
The clause was designed around, we'd had a period of time, particularly around the Early Stewart sockeye management, where we had extensive closures or restricted fishing, and at the same time was co-migrating other species, in this case primarily Chinook, and there was quite a bit of interest from the First Nations to continue those fisheries. So in trying to formulate plans minimizing impacts on Early Stewarts, so instead of having a total closure to all fishing, we looked at other options. And so, different types of gear and things like that. You still resulted in some impact to the, in this case, the Early Stewart sockeye. And so, where people were accessing those fish, the idea is that they would return all live fish to the water where they could. But if they had fish that were dead or thought to have very little chance for survival, that they should keep those and help to meet the food, social, ceremonial needs. And so the department has a few different types of clauses in some of the communal licenses and agreements on how to try to best cover that off. But that's the rationale behind it.
Okay. Mr. Cray, from a First Nations perspective, how does the clause like this fit with First Nations ethic or First Nations worldview? That is the idea that once a fish is caught and is already dead, it doesn't need to be thrown back but can be kept and consumed.
I would say that that's an accurate reflection. Where we've moved to, of the First Nations
Yes.
perspective, it's an accurate reflection. Where we've moved to the now with the department, Mr. Commissioner, is we're looking at arrangements where the number of mortalities that might occur be monitored closely. In other words, there be a ceiling to the number of mortalities that might be induced, or the number of fish that might die. So we're in discussions with the Lower Fraser on that very issue right now.
Mr. Rosenberger, has the presence of this clause, from your observation, caused enforcement challenges or led to unintended harvest?
I'm aware of people indicating that they believe that there's been some unintended harvest. There's at least one example that I'm aware of, but for the most part I think it's tried to meet the intent of what we were striving for. And as Mr. Craig has pointed out, we're looking at trying to modify this into the future to move away from some of the uncertainty or potential impacts to conservation. So I think we've been able to make some progress around it.
What magnitude of fish have been taken pursuant to this type of clause?
Again, as Mr. Craig just pointed out, so the process that we're using and have for the last 2 or 3 years is taking the Early Stewart sharing arrangement. So in the case of planning for 2010 for this year, we have a midpoint forecast number of 17,000. Our objective is to try to protect 90% of that population. So when we take a look at the test fishing impacts, which are usually in around 2% on that size of a stock, so we're planning for about 8% impact, and we use the sharing arrangement that we have from the Early Stewart agreement that was largely developed by the First Nations, as we heard earlier, and carried forward with some modifications to today. And so those impacts to the Early Stewarts are shared out geographically. In this case, in the Lower Fraser, they would be entitled to some portion of that. I think it's roughly 1,300 or 1,400 fish this year, so it's probably in the range of 200 or 300 fish. And so they need to figure out how to work that into their objective of trying to maximize harvest of Chinook. So looking at gear impacts, and if you want to have release mortality rates, for example, of using dip nets and beach seines where it's down in the 0.5% range versus gill nets that have about 60% mortality. So trying to work through those types of management arrangements in order to be able to best utilize this encounter and mortality factor.
Okay, you mentioned the dip nets with a fairly low mortality rate in your answer right there. In 2009, are you aware of an example where a significant number of fish were taken in a dip net fishery as mortally wounded?
I am.
And how many are we talking about?
The total harvest in that particular area was in the 6,000 to 7,000 range.
And those fish were kept ostensibly pursuant to a clause like the mortally wounded clause?
That's correct.
And these were Fraser sockeye?
That's correct.
I wanted to ask you about one other clause that is sometimes found in fishing agreements or an arrangement that exists in fishing agreements. And that's the concept of dual fishing. As I understand it, there are certain challenges that have been identified, at least by some, with respect to FSC fishing and commercial fishing taking place on the same boat at the same time or one after the other without a landing in between. Is that an issue that you have some familiarity with, Mr. Rosenberger?
I do.
Okay, I wonder if you could offer your thoughts on any challenges associated with the concept of dual fishing that the department has identified.
I think you've started on the path in describing that people are fishing for two different purposes, in this case commercial, at the same time as food, social, ceremonial. So the areas they get to fish, the gear they get to use might be different if they had by each of the licenses. So there's concerns and issues to be thought about of areas that might be closed to commercial fishing but not necessarily closed to food, social, ceremonial. The allocation of those fish, where they're going to be offloaded and managed, how the sharing arrangements might occur from the given vessel. But they also offer a number of opportunities. If we had the commercial venture operating where it was releasing all these non-target species, but the First Nations were going to be out with another license following up, shortly thereafter. What's the release mortality rate that would occur in the commercial fishery? What's the added impact of that food, social, ceremonial fisheries? So we're striving to do here is trying to meet two objectives, and many fisheries programs have challenges to be thought about in their management implications. But hopefully the objective here is to work through some of those, and we've largely tried to do it on a limited basis to work through so we don't end up with significant problems that were unanticipated until we can get some concurrence on how it might operate.
Okay, I wonder if any of the other panel members have comments on the either benefits or challenges associated with dual fishing. Mr. Crary, Mr. Wilson, it may be more
Yes, thanks.
for the two of you.
I think this notion of the dual fishery is one that occurs in marine waters. There aren't dual fisheries on the Lower Fraser, insofar as I'm aware of. So I think it's really a phenomena of marine-based fisheries arrangements that the department has attempted to sort out with the First Nations in, the approach waters.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, do you have any comment?
Yes, there are opportunities to engage in dual fishing in the marine waters, and one of the challenges with the fishery, and actually one of the benefits of the fishery, is that knowing the fisherman has a quota, and quite often he goes over his quota. So if there's an opportunity for the excess fish to go to FSC, then they would go about a dual fishing license.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And just one final question, coming back to the co-management issue. And maybe I'll just start with Mr. Rosenberger and move down the panel. We've talked today about the involvement of First Nations in management of the resource and moving forward to attaining that. Mr. Rosenberg, from the department's perspective, what role, where do other harvesters or interested parties fit into this scheme?
Co-management, I don't think is the concept is for First Nations and the department only. The idea of co-management is arrangements that we're striving for to integrate everyone. So we have an objective of a fishery for all. We're looking to try to bring all parties together. The co-management arrangements that we're striving for with First Nations are one aspect of that, but we're also trying to bring all parties to the table in processes like the integrated fisheries management plan development through groups like the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee. So the longer term objective is co-management across all parties that are participating in fisheries or have interest in fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Shepherd.
Well, I think given the fiduciary responsibility of the federal government in this case, I think that my understanding in the way that things are falling out is that a strong Tier 1 process, in other words, a First Nation to First Nation process with a strong First Nation to government relationship is the cornerstone for improved decision-making, for improved and better relationships amongst all the parties. But I do think it has to go in that order. I think that having good, stable governance within the First Nations and then with the government itself is going to be very beneficial and very positive to developing the later what we refer to in the business as the Tier 3, which are the other parties.
Thank you, Mr. Cray.
I would agree with Mr. Shepherd. Right now, we're working hard, overtime actually, to build a strong Tier 1 level process, and the department encourages that in a number of different ways. For example, they're funding organizations to do that kind of work, and often at Tier 2 level meetings, this is when the First Nations meet jointly with DFO. Sometimes the daily agenda is divided between Tier 1 meetings where the First Nations discuss issues between and amongst themselves, and in the afternoon DFO is brought into the room, and then we're in Tier 2 mode. So we're working hard to strengthen Tier 1 and Tier 2, but Mr. Commissioner, I'd like folks to understand that in the Lower Fraser, notwithstanding our strong desire to strengthen the Tier 1 and 2 level relationships between and amongst ourselves and our work with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, we're well on our way on the Lower Fraser to inaugurating working relationships with sport and commercial fishing interests. For example, we've collaborated with commercial fishermen, what had been known as the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board. They went out and caught a large number of sockeye, raised a substantial amount of funds, the purpose of which was to drive those monies, those resources, into protecting and conserving Cultus Lake sockeye salmon. So money was spent on programs such as milfoil removal from the lake, removing predators from the lake that would consume juvenile salmon. Once they've passed the egg stage, they've hatched out. They're now immature fish. There are predators in the lake. So out of that fund that these good commercial fishermen helped raise, we undertook those types of programs in the Cultus Lake proper, and also work with the nearby lab and hatchery facility on Cultus Lake sockeye. So whilst we're concentrating on the Tier 1 and Tier 2 level efforts, on the lower river we've already began the process of reaching out to other interests in the fishery, in anticipation that ultimately we will be working far more closely with them and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, do you have anything to add?
I concur with Mr. Shepherd and Mr. Cray, only to add that we are also engaged with the sport fishing industry and working on impact benefit agreements.
Thank you. Mr. Rosenberger, just one thing I neglected to ask you when we were speaking about the mortally wounded clause. You indicated that there was a harvest in a dipneck fishery of 6,000 to 7,000 in 2009. Did that number exceed the number that the department anticipated would have been mortally wounded, given the fishery that was conducted?
It did.
Okay. Mr. Commissioner, those are my questions for the panel. Ms. Gardner will be going next.
Just before Ms. Gardner, I wonder if I could just ask the panel to follow up on Mr. Cray's remarks. And perhaps Mr. Rosenberger, if you could just explain to me, you mentioned attending 20 to 30 meetings, and I think Mr. Shepherd said about the same number. Mr. Cray thinks it's a lot more. It probably is. And Mr. Wilson thought perhaps somewhat less. But in the course of those meetings, you've used the term Tier 1 and Tier 2, and I think Mr. Cray was alluding to discussions with the non-Aboriginal community around some of the issues he has addressed here today. If you could just explain to me, on the co-management that you've been discussing this morning, Do you, Mr. Rosenberger, when you're having your meetings, bring into those discussions views with respect to the non-Aboriginal, the future non-Aboriginal involvement in a co-managed system? Or is that for a later date? Or is that something that has a different agenda to it in terms of where those meetings would take place? I don't have a sense now as to how, you use the term, I think, and I want to apologize to you, I didn't write it down. Eventually you would have a co-managed fishery, I think. But that's, perhaps I'm misinterpreting your words. But do you come to those meetings with an understanding that ties together what Mr. Cray has described and perhaps Mr. Shepherd regarding the future and what it holds for these different fisheries?
On an annual basis, the comments and concerns, recommendations that are put forward by recreational or commercial or other non-government organizations like the Marine Conservation Caucus, if those issues have not been raised by them in a letter or some format to First Nations, the department does raise many of those in some of our co-management meetings. Specifically on some of the longer-term objectives of trying to develop a more robust multi-party process. I would say that doesn't take up a lot of our time at this stage. I'm sure it's had some discussions in the roadmap process that I'm more on the periphery of and not attending on all those sessions. But people who attend the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee have a sense of the objectives in that forum of bringing people's essentially differences together and how we can try to resolve them. So I'm sure there's good awareness amongst most of the First Nations people. Some of the fisheries that we've had considerable discussion on in the last couple of years, as Mr. Cray talked about earlier here around early time Chinook, the ideas and some of the objectives that some of the other groups have had, the department has brought that into the process, so that First Nations are hearing some of that type of dialogue. So on developing the process further, I would think that it would be something that would be built on, discussed in the roadmap process and in other forums that we have that are going on. The First Nations Fisheries Council is talking about, how we would develop broader forums like this now, and probably to some degree in the Fraser, but in non-Fraser areas. But I would think that at this stage, it's another step that needs to occur in the overall process, and that's not the step right now, other than the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, where it's potentially occurring.
So I didn't want to lose the opportunity if any of the other panel members have a view, just to hear what their views might be.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add, Mr. Commissioner, is the very good work we were doing with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board to protect Cultus Lake sockeye. They did a great job of fundraising by conducting a fishery. That type of fishery, Mr. Commissioner, was possible before a very notable decision was made at the Supreme Court. I think it's commonly referred to as the Larocque decision. Before the Larocque decision, it was possible to undertake the kind of project that we did with the Commercial Salmon Advisory Board. But I understand now, and I put myself in better hands, legal hands. They advise us, as well as the department advises us, it won't be possible to repeat that kind of effort in the future, which is sad, but a reality we have to face. So if we're going to continue our work with this particular unique stock of sockeye salmon, namely the Cultus Lake sockeye, we're gonna have to find other ways of fundraising to keep the effort alive, to keep this threatened stock of sockeye alive in the water for the future. How we might do that is not clear yet. Where we may find those resources hasn't been determined yet, but it's a very much an issue that's alive for us.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, it's a little different for the LSIC. Up to last year, there was no Tier 1 and Tier 2 process for the HLSIC. In fact, it was the IMOG that just started the process up to last year. And up to then, under the AFS agreement, we were obligated to attend the sectoral meetings, and there were up to 28 sectoral meetings. Sectoral meetings that addressed the IFMPs. At those meetings, you had First Nations, commercial, sport, any other user groups within the meeting. So with the IMOG coming in line, they've started to take on some of the roles in attendance to those meetings. So there would be a pre-season meeting and a post-season meeting. There was no in-season meeting happenings on the IFMPs.
Anything to add, Mr. Shepherd? Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. It's Brenda Gartner, and with me, Leah Pence. And I understand that right now I'm allocated around 65 minutes, so I'll get about half of it done before the break and then pick up after the lunch hour. And I regret, but I'm going to have to do a little bit of background again and move into some of these key topics, but I will return to the co-management topic for sure. Coalition Document 121. Mr. Shepherd, is this your CV?
Yes.
And I'm wondering if I could have that marked as a next exhibit. For some reason, we used his bio this morning rather than his CV.
That's exhibit 1251.
And you're presently sitting on the Fraser panel, is that correct, Mr. Shepherd?
Yes.
And you were a member of the FRAS executive from 2002 until 2007?
Yes.
And you still are, are you now still the executive director at the UFFCA, or is that completed now?
I'm done.
Okay. But you were there for approximately 6 or 7 years?
From the inception right through till about 2 years ago.
All right. And I'm wondering, in the Commission Council's questions this morning, there was, at least from my tone of our hearing it, there was some suggestion that these different organizations are a little uncoordinated from a First Nations perspective. And I'm wondering if you could give the Commissioner a little background as to what you saw were some of the challenges when you started working at the Fraser watershed level with FRAS, and the sort of history of some of that challenge.
The challenges were far and broad. There were many challenges to face in terms of working at a watershed level. I think the capacity issue on both sides. We're into an attrition situation within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. I know they're trying hard to bring up young and upcoming folks to take on some of the responsibilities. For example, Mr. Rosenberg is going to be leaving here fairly quickly the next while, and there's a number of them coming. So there's a lack of capacity on both sides, and that's been well acknowledged. I think that, again, going back to some of the things back in the inception of these programs, the funding situation was extremely onerous. The work required to get monies flowing for these organizations was incredible, and so there was a lot of work. We would go probably from March right through till sometimes well into June and even into July, where there would be no funds flowing. Now, when you're working on preparing fishing plans and trying to develop positions and so on and so forth as a Fraser as a whole, and doing the science around it, you need to make sure that your scientists are going to get paid, because they don't work if they don't get paid. So that was a big problem, and I think that it created some tension and so on. So that was a big issue. I think also going back to those early days, I think that there was definitely a lack. There was not. Today, I think within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, you have a lot of staff at all levels within policy, within management, within science, who recognize that the worldview is changing and respect that and have been around long enough to understand it. But back in 2002 and stuff, I didn't think that you didn't have across department a view that First Nations and co-management would even work. Particularly in stock assessment and other areas that I've always found very difficult to work with. It's kind of like they have their own established way of doing business, and they're very slow to change. So I found those very challenging. So, in the beginning, I think that those challenges, some of them have been worked through, some of them are still remain to be worked upon. But I think that there's general concordance within both Department and First Nations that this is going to happen. It's just a matter of how and when.
And similarly, what challenges were occurring intertribally within the Fraser watershed when you started?
Well,
the intertribal level is, of course, has its own suite of issues. Upper Fraser, Mid Fraser, and Lower Fraser, and approach indeed, have different needs, different ways, different fisheries, and they have a long history. And so I think that some of the challenges related to that were, first of all, getting the players to the table. I think that in the beginning stages post-Sparrow, 93, there was divisiveness, and I think we heard some of that last week. Those that signed, those that didn't, those that were
Signed what? Sorry.
Signed AFS agreements.
Thank you.
It became divisive, and I think that some of those divisive issues are still playing out today. Although I think we're making traction, I think that the issues between the different regions on the Fraser are still working themselves out, and how they're going to talk to each other, how they're going to work together and the betterment and sustainability of the salmon.
We heard evidence last week on how FRAS continued after the Fraser Watershed Agreement was no longer continued. What role has FRAS continued to support with respect to fisheries conservation issues and management issues, and how do you see it evolving within a mandated Tier 1 process?
Okay, so that's a lot of question. So let's...
What role does FRAS play, and then
Yep.
how do you see it evolving?
So the role FRAS plays, we have the FRAS organization had initially a very great and highly respected scientist working on board who's been around since its inception. That's Mr. Mike Staley. He provides incredible technical support to other technicians out in the field and continues to do that. I think to a certain degree Mike is also a kind of a mentor to some of the younger biologists that are coming up now through the ropes, through the ladders. We have, at any given time, we had Ken Wilson working with the organization, who was developing on behalf of First Nations different papers, for example, on Frizzy, the Frizzy process, the Fraser River Sockeye Spawning Initiative. Because it was so complex and so confusing, we needed somebody who have that kind of expertise. So Ken Wilson fulfilled that. We now have Pete Nicklin working there. We had Penny White up until recently. So the technical support, which goes out to the regions, these are highly technical folks who work with technical people more on the regions to help develop their programs, to help develop their positions and so on. So it was an incredible support. It also provided a forum for everybody to come together to talk. It would set the agendas. We at one point have a joint technical committee which continues to function and will get tremendous support, hopefully, in the future and moving forward. The Fraser Watershed Technical Committee is an extremely important development that came out of that and continues to be, because it is looking at very highly complex and technical issues, both in the past and now.
And do you see those technical overviews to be complementary to the work that is done at the UFFCA level? It's not, or duplicative?
No, I think very, very much complementary. The whole point is to not have duplication at the watershed level, and that it is complementary and supportive.
And do you also see it helpful in terms of developing the scale analysis that will be necessary for a Fraser watershed process?
Scale analysis, DNA, a lot of the work that the Pacific Salmon Commission currently is undertaking, a lot of First Nations are situating themselves to be able to take on a lot of that kind of work.
Actually, that's a great twist of the word scale analysis. What I meant there...
Oh, I thought you were talking about scale, sorry.
That's great. What I meant there was a scale analysis in terms of what decisions can be made collectively and where, and
Right.
what issues have to be had
At which
where.
scale.
So at which scale of decision making.
It's okay. So the question then becomes, is FRAFS situated to help delineate those scales and to support those different scales?
And is their work actually helping to do that on the ground?
Absolutely, and in my opinion, and having been around it for so long, that particular process is where I think that the rubber really will hit the road in terms of a collaborative management agreement, in terms of developing the technical agenda for Fraser for both now and into the future, working with the department and developing that agenda. And I think that the Joint Technical Working Group is making a really good headway in terms of developing that. So you have a DFO person and a First Nations person, I think Jamie Scroggie and Pete Nicklin, working together, both scientists. They set the agendas for future meetings, they do the invitations, and they jointly chair the meetings, which I think is a great step forward in terms of developing that collaborative relationship and tone for development.
We heard last week from Grand Chief Salteri and others about the efforts that he's doing with respect to the ITO. How would FRAS collaborate or work with an organization that was built out of the ITO, or could it?
I think it can. I think my perspective on it is that it will continue to operate, the Joint Technical Working Group, and the intertribal organization is continuing to try to make headway in terms of developing the nation-scale concept. It's very easy to see that in the future, if the intertribal organization were to get grounded and footed and supported, that the whole FRAFS organization would simply just become a part of the ITO. It's a slam dunk, in my opinion.
Thank you. And then let's go a little bit closer into history. We've heard a little bit about the forum. I'd like to take you to Exhibit 290, which was tab 10 of the Commission documents. That document lays out a bit of the history of the forum. I know you know that history without looking at the document. But I was curious about some language that's in Exhibit 290 and then also in the complementary exhibit, which I don't have the number for. It's First Nations Document 82. It was marked on Thursday in the Furry. But the comment is, you can see it in its completed draft in the final form, which is Exhibit 290 on the bottom of the page. Through this process, it became clear that despite the efforts of DFO staff to support this outcome, First Nations collectively lacked the capacity to develop a coordinated FSC harvest sharing plan for Fraser River salmon stocks. Could you give the Commissioner a little bit of background as to that perspective and the potential challenges that kind of perspective might have brought into the discussions at Forum?
So just to be clear, this document is from the department's perspective, and the department has identified that First Nations have significant challenges in terms of making this happen. Well, I think that getting off the process, let's say that I support the development of such a process, but I think it's unfair to say that it's only the First Nations, for example, that are having an issue here. I think, first of all, I was right, the 2008, by coming to First Nations only in times of low abundance was, in my opinion, already the first mistake. I mean, it was needed, and I understand why DFO needed to do this, because it's a very, very tenuous situation for the department to be able to say, well, we're going to tell you how much you get when there's no abundance. That puts them in a very bad situation. So from their perspective, I could see why they would want to have such a forum so that some of the hard work could be done for them. So I think that not only so we're already off on a kind of a bad footing because we're only talking about low abundance. The question is, when are we going to sit down and talk about when there's lots of fish to share? When are First Nations in the Upper Fraser going to actually have a chance to have too many fish? I've never seen it in the 15 years I've worked there. So I think that got things kind of off to a bad start. I think that there's also capacity issues within the department. It's not just the First Nations issue that we're talking about here. They're spread thin. They've got good staff, good, well-meaning staff, yet at the same time, it's getting the right staff and the right people in those rooms to sit down and have those discussions has been I would say, continuously a problem. I think that the whole issue of the title and rights issue has always been a bit of a sore point from that perspective as well. It's never been put on the table. A lot of First Nations don't find that it's helpful when there's no recognition of that. And again, it's at the end of the day, from an Upper Fraser perspective, it's about conservation, and certainly this is about sharing fish. What about the conservation of the fish? And I think many people want to get into that discussion, yet it seems to be labored by how much for each. So I think that those are some of the shortcomings that I can think of offhand.
Shortcomings. The forum has continued to meet. We heard that, and that it has continued to meet approximately 4 times a year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And at those meetings, you're now dealing with operational issues as distinct from the broader co-management process issues. Is that correct?
Essentially, I think that the forum process has become the operational arm, as opposed to the roadmap. Roadmap is kind of the overarching, looking at a long-term agreement, where the forum process is about, okay, what are we going to do for 2012?
And so would it be fair to characterize the forum process as the developing stages of an exchange at a watershed and approach level on operational issues?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm wondering if I could bring forward First Nation documents. I'm going to work with 3, 4, 5, and 6 next. And through your experience with the forum, is it your observation, or could you tell me your observation as to the development of capacity of the First Nations during that process? Is it working? Is it functional?
I think that over the last 3.5 years, there's been a tremendous amount of capacity developed with First Nations, recognizing that this is a very complicated issue, that it's not as easy as just, screaming up and down about a number or anything else. There's a lot of things that have been learned in those rooms. We know that the difficult situation that the department is in, and then also recognizing that these fish need to be shared. So I think that the way that the dialogue is rolled out, there's been a tremendous amount of learning amongst each other. What I think that Chris Cook put it well, who's a chief from the Quadute people, that prior to the forum process, the relationships between the coastal First Nations and the inland First Nations were at a really bad point. They weren't together anymore. There was no forums. There was no way for them to even talk. And over the last 3.5 years, we've been able to develop a tremendous amount of understanding, trust, and knowledge of each other's fisheries. And I think that keeping those people in the room is significant to sustainability.
Thank you. I wonder if you could look at the document that's in front of you, and can you identify this as a letter that was sent to Sue Farlinger from the First Nations Forum participants in February of 2011?
Yes.
May I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1,252.
If I could then go to the, and Mr. Commissioner, you'll see in that letter the nature of the types of issues. I don't think we'll get into them in detail given the limited time I have with this panel, but you'll recognize that the forum is sending letters to Sue Farlinger, the Pacific RDG, on the IFM pre-process, the recreational fishing issues, and priority FSC fisheries. Could I then go to document number 4? Mr. Shepherd, do you recognize this letter as the response to the previous document to Chief Ken Malloway of the Fraser River Forum and the FRAS?
Yes.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1,253.
And then can I go to document number 5? Mr. Shepherd, do you recognize this document as, again, the response from the forum participants in this continuing exchange?
Yes.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1,254.
And then go to document 6. Mr. Shepherd, do you recognize that as the response of the department to that previous letter?
Yes, I do.
May I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1,255.
Now may I go to Canada's document 48? And Mr. Crayon, Mr. Shepherd, do you recognize this? Well, I'll start with Marcel. Do you, sorry, Mr. Shepherd, do you recognize this document?
I do.
And what is this?
These are the recommendations for the, I believe, for the IFMP, aren't they not?
And do you recall what year that's in? Is that 2011 or 2010?
2010.
And may I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1,256.
And could I go to the second page of that document? Mr. Commissioner, you'll see on the second page a list of sockeye recommendations that came from the forum to the department. What success did you have in achieving any of these recommendations, Mr. Shepherd?
Well, these came from the department, so these are, this is how you test the whether or not they were successful. So the first one, the window closure, for example, to protect early stewards for 3 weeks, was agreed to by the First Nations in those rooms, and the department has taken those recommendations and they've implemented them. Recommendation number 2, although from the Upper Fraser perspective, they were pushing for a lot longer, an additional 3-week window closure, I believe, at this particular juncture. They were only afforded 1 week. We didn't feel that this was adequate enough to protect these early steward stocks, and I don't think that the science community would disagree with that. Although it's the best that could come out of that forum process.
Could you tell me whether there's any drawbacks in the present system around sending in recommendations and then hoping that the department is going to respond to them, and whether or not you can see any room for improvement there?
I do. I think that, I understand how the process works in the sense that the department, in many ways, takes all the information from all of the different sectors, and then it goes away, and then we get recommendations. We get what was accepted and what wasn't, and usually some sort of a rationale. Although we don't understand who made the decision or why the decision was made, we're just simply told these are the recommendations, and this is kind of, we heard what you said, this is how it works. In my opinion, there's definite room for improvement. I think that, again, starting with the technical agenda, setting the technical agenda, working through those technical agendas at the watershed and then the sub-regions from there would greatly improve understanding of how decisions are made. And that way, I think you'd have less, sort of ill will or feelings of negativity from the First Nations because they're not understanding where decisions are made or why.
Mr. Cray, do you have anything to add to this conversation at this point in time?
Well, I'd agree with that. Sorry, Mr. Commissioner, I didn't have my mouth beside the microphone, but now I do. What you're describing here is very much they pitch and we swing. And we need to move past that kind of working arrangement with the department where they come forward with recommendations and we respond, and then there's a long pause before we know what their next response is.
Thank you.
There are different ways that we could go about doing business to deal with issues such as this, and maybe we'll get there.
Mr. Rosenberger, you know this concern, is that correct? The concern the First Nations raise about providing information and not knowing how it's relied upon?
I think as Mr. Shepherd pointed out, the recommendations that are made by the First Nations Forum, whether it's collectively or any individual First Nation or groups of them that write to the department responds back on behalf of the department, acknowledging receipt of the recommendations. It also indicates, as Mr. Shepherd pointed out, those recommendations that are being adopted and those that may not be or might be modified, and the rationale behind them. So the documentation and the rationale behind them, I think, is fairly clearly made. There's been significant work, in particular the last 3 to 4 years, to make sure that that's occurring in a written format, so there's not misunderstandings of individuals from within the department giving responses that might not be or were concerned about not being consistent in the past. So this is one way of making sure that that occurs.
And do you see a decision-making structure between First Nations and DFO as an improvement to the present frustrations between these two governments?
As we talked before the break, I think a structure where there's clear mandate on both parties' side, clear allocations, and clear responsibilities to groups, so understanding where decisions would be made, at what level, how they would play out. And so just an example I would just use is these recommendations, contrary to Mr. Shepherd's comment that these are the department's recommendations, these in fact were the recommendations made by First Nations to the department this year. In these recommendations, and Mr. Shepherd pointed to recommendation number 2 where he didn't agree with it, but in that forum that came to us as a recommendation that there was agreement. We have other letters and other concerns from some groups, some of them in the Upper Fraser, where they would like to see things differently, and that's the part of the process where we need to work forward and get to those clear mandates, responsibilities, and what decisions will be made where either within the watershed or approach areas, so in the broader context. So your question, if it's do we need to work on a more formalized process, we do. Does it need to be clear to people what it means? And that's the roadmap process at this stage that we're striving to bring those elements together.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, it's a little off my script for a second, but Mr. Rosenberger, would you agree also that removing the department's role in resolving disputes between the tribes would also be useful going forward? And if there was another process for the tribes to resolve their disputes that didn't have the department doing it, that would be helpful?
The First Nations clearly need to have a process. If they're going to have a common allocation that they're going to work through sharing arrangements, they're going to have to work on that side of things. Currently, when that doesn't exist, the department is left in the position where they're making trade-offs at times, or adopting one recommendation versus a different party's recommendation, or potentially deciding on a whole different one that might be the department did develop. So a process amongst First Nations on how they will resolve their conflict, I think, will be key for them in the longer term.
Would be useful for them and also useful for co-management, is that correct?
I think it's clear that that's needed from their side as well as a process when we get into co-management objectives.
Thank you. I'm going to go to another topic now, Mr. Commissioner. Shall I use the next 4 minutes? And yes, I think so. I actually am going to go to joint management. And Mr. Shepherd, I heard your evidence this morning around joint management, and in particular the benefits around allocation. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the value of joint management to the conservation of Fraser River sockeye stocks.
I think, again, if I can just use the same example that we have on the screen, it's the 1 week window closure. Barry was right. You know, there was concurrence in the room at the time. Mr. Rosenberger, pardon me. There was concurrence in the room at the time. Yet at the same time, knowing that the Upper Fraser spent lots of time demonstrating to the rest of the watershed that these particular stocks of early summer sockeye were in precipitous decline, 16 years in fact. We have Taseko, Nadina, my daughter is named Nadina, by the way, it's in my traditional territory. The Nadina stocks, Taseko and Bowron are they're on the verge of collapse. And so First Nations have shown, we had the biologist in the Upper Fraser go take all the data and work it and to demonstrate and show the declining trend. And so conservation is of the uttermost importance for these stocks if we want to see them in the future and have access to them in the future. We recognize that something needed to be done. Now, coming to the forum was good. I mean, the relationships have been developed, yet at the same time, the Upper Fraser First Nations felt that conservation was not being taken seriously enough, that more opportunities were allowed for other fisheries. In particular, in this particular case, it's been an issue because this goes back to the Pacific Salmon Treaty with the United States. There's a bit of a conundrum that the government gets itself into year in and year out with respect to the early summers, and that is we need to get the First Nations out of the water as quick as possible so that we can allow as many commercial fisheries as possible. So, in my opinion, this has never worked to meet the conservation at the end of the day for Upper Fraser First Nations. We don't meet our food needs, and the Dina Run is in decline, the Bowron and the Taseko as well. So this is a classic case of how First Nations being so linked to those areas would, just by their very nature, provide the conservation that is necessary for future runs.
Thank you. I wonder if I could take Mr. Shepherd to First Nations Coalition document number 28. Are you familiar with this article?
Yes,
And have you reviewed it?
I did.
And you'll see that this is an article by a number of scientists looking at the value of co-management in a number of different countries around the world. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And it is their conclusion that co-management holds great promise for successful and sustainable fisheries worldwide?
Yes,
And do you agree with that?
I do.
I have that marked as the next exhibit.
1,257.
I'm wondering if this is an appropriate time to take
All right.
the...
Yes, thank you. Hearing is now adjourned until 2 p.m.